Everyone thinks every promoter's a millionaire. That's absolute fiction. It doesn't exist.
There's a couple of things that AI can never touch, where we'll always beat the bots, and that's in what it is to be human and flawed and messy.
When I see people videoing a whole set, I'm like, you will never ever watch that ever again. No one's getting parachuted in. So unless that's taken more seriously, there's going to be more failings. You're going to see less people and artists come through.
In a world obsessed with AI, what is the real value of a messy dance floor? What if the slow death of club culture was closing the door for a whole generation trying to get into the creative industries? Today, we're joined by Nick Morgan with a foot in two very different worlds, the established, regulated UK music scene and the vast, chaotic, opportunity-filled market of the US. We're going to pull back the curtain on why your favourite small club is struggling to survive, expose the massive cultural and legal differences between the two countries, and hear a personal story of climbing the ladder from lighting jock to industry player. So, Nick, I think a good place to begin would be let's talk about, are people still partying? Are young people still partying? And if they are, is it different? Has it changed? What kind of new pressures are there? I've read a lot of people saying that young people can't afford to go out anymore, which always seems a bit of a misnomer to me because young people could never afford to go out ever, and yet they did. They made it happen. So, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think they do want to go out. I think they're much more selective in what that experience is, whether that's drinking. We've seen a drinking culture, which is, where people sort of nurture and they maybe only have one or two cocktails, whereas back in my day, it was quite a volume-based activity. And I agree. I think, when I was younger, I couldn't afford to go out and you scraped everything together because for me, that was the sort of crescendo of the week. Everything was centered around culture, going out, engaging with, new artists, new music, and I do think things have changed. I mean, everyone's very negative about, the current situation. There are some massive challenges, not to get straight into it, but one of them being talent costs, are not as equal as they used to be. There's a massive divide between the headline and the sort of, the sort of B and B to C. The gap's wider than it's ever been. So it is hard to sort of support the nurturing and the newer talent. But I do believe they still want to go out. We're seeing all our shows this summer have sold really well. They're just much more selective, and everyone talks about cost of living. I think people have less money generally. Where they maybe used to go to 6 shows a season, they only go to 1, but obviously that's 83% reduction in their normal ticket capacity. So that's a challenge for us as sort of organisers.
So it seems to be that festivals are still actually doing relatively well, and it's mostly the club nights that are failing. And a lot of people believe that club nights are failing because they're so kind of binary in their offering. It's just one sort of music, usually all night, couple of rooms, and that's it. Whereas if young people or people, it doesn't matter if you're young, are thinking about the is it worth it test, it would seem that festivals probably pass that is it worth it test more because of the variety of different experiences you can have there.
Yeah, and I think there is a sort of subculture. Generally when things get very commercial, you then get an underground movement reappearing, and I think things have gone a bit underground. So in East London, I've seen more clubs in the last year popping up than probably in the last 5, which is, they're nurturing their own audiences. It's not driven around headline. So shows like Adonis, for example, where huge following, not booking on headline talent, sits around Shay, who's the promoter on it, he's a DJ as well. So that's exciting, and I do think those are happening. I think the mega club, as they used to be called in the 80s, they're not as relevant as they used to be. When you're trying to do, there are the occasional thing like you want to know drum sheds in Tottenham, but I think those big mega clubs like Ministry in the end, they're not as relevant because audiences have changed. They don't necessarily want to go to those sort of events, and they may choose a festival where they're seeing multi-genre of music and also lots of different talent, I guess.
Yeah, I went to Peckham Audio about 2 weeks ago. I went to see X Stacy. He's actually quite a big headliner, I think, and his next gig was at I think at the O2 Centre. So quite a contrast because Peckham Audio is about, I don't even think it's 350, but the mosh pit was alive and well, so that was nice to see, and it was a great gig. So I think I agree. I think that things do pop up, especially around Peckham. But again, I think it's linked, isn't it, to where there are affordable spaces. So for how long? It used to be that people would like look at London and say that certain areas are kind of coloured in, and there are little pockets kind of left, but those little pockets are getting harder and harder to find. So yeah, in Peckham you could get somewhere quite cheaply. I used to go to Utah all the time, speaking about where you are in the US, and in Utah you could get some incredible kind of spaces where the event spaces where they'd put like happenings on and they'd have bands and bars and little kind of like makeshift DIY things. What are your thoughts on like protecting those spaces? Is it possible to protect those spaces, or does the culture just have to keep moving around and finding these pockets of venues and areas where it's cheaper to run things and start things?
Yeah, I think you're very heavily reliant on the landlord. Unfortunately, landlords have increasingly obviously wanting to put up rent is unaffordable. So I think, and also regulation, that's the other big hitter. So like Soho, we've seen a massive decline in late night entertainment because my belief is it's just over-regulated. There wasn't the belief of how important the nighttime economy is, and it's absolutely central, I think, to any city, to any culture. And I think that got lost in all of the recent and maybe current government. Hopefully there's a sea change. There's a new thing. Sadiq has been given extra powers that they're going to stress test in London to hopefully deregulate some of the sort of operating hours for clubs and bars. So that'll be good. Obviously, there was a massive sea change and the licensing changed. So there used to be this natural progression. You go to a bar and then you'd go to a club and all the bars shut at 11. So I think that was in 2003. So that obviously had a massive change, because bars could obviously then compete with nightclubs and didn't necessarily have entry fees. So that was a sea change moment, I think, for culture in Britain. And I do think currently, yeah, landlords are, yeah, I wouldn't like to use the word greedy often, but if they offer to, it's just not unaffordable. What I mean, if you're trying to create a creative space that's then accessible and then you can price accordingly on the door. And there's lots of artists like Sherelle has been very vocal about this. She's been talking about making clubs more affordable, but then you need the whole ecosystem bought in, whether that be the landlord, talent as well, because obviously it has to all make money. And if people are drinking less, then, the bars aren't going to make the same sort of volume of money. So it's all, people understanding the whole ecosystem is really important. I think there's a lot of knowledge void between all these different silos.
Do you think there's still a space for real subculture then, particularly in the cities where it's more premium?
I do. I mean, I know someone who's just opened a brand new 300 capacity club. I mean, it's in a hotel, so you could argue that's a subculture thing. But they're trying to curate it on non-headline talent, and that's in Mayfair because the landlord really believes in sort of subculture and creating an ecosystem and an incubation unit. But those landlords are rare. I was actually with someone in Denver on Saturday. A guy called Diego used to run the pickle factory in Miami, and he's doing a hybrid with a landlord here, which is he also runs public records in New York, and that is really exciting because that's a new space, and the landlord's totally on board, and it is around subculture. The club's only 150 capacity potentially, and there's a workspace and stuff. So it's really essential that you need the key, which is the landlord, to be on board, I think. Otherwise, it's just unaffordable, isn't it?
Yeah, and when it comes to like putting on those kind of those acts and the talent with subculture, how would you define what those acts are? What would you say is kind of the difference between the sort of Beyonces and the more kind of like subculture? Because for subculture, me was never about a look or a sound. It's a mindset and it's a strategy. So it could look and sound like anything. It's not even about youth. It's youthful, but it's not just youth. So I always find it interesting when people talk about subculture and they say there's no such thing as subculture anymore. It's probably because they're not thinking about it. They're thinking about it in terms of a look or a fashion or a sound. And it's not. It's not a punk t-shirt and it's not, it's not those kind of like tropes around it. It's more of a mindset. So when those sort of venues, what kind of talent would be put on in those places?
I mean, I think it's more about, for me, it's not necessarily genre or talent. It's anything that's it's all about sort of an incubation system. So somewhere where someone can, be tried. They maybe be an early stage producer, for example. They've got a little bit of a fan base. They want to start breaking records, often their own. And they've got the support of that club. That for me, it doesn't matter what genre of music it is. It's more about, how do we incubate them, and that's where
Right.
people start to learn about them, follow them, what I mean? And hopefully they get on that road to a career, of some form. But, they're coming in, they're regulars as well, and they build up I think they're part of the sort of club system. They're regularly there. They then get to know the audience who are come regulars as well. I think that's what's important to me, is that commonality, knowing people in that little system. And that could be a club.
Yeah. And how do you manage, do you try and replicate that always at the festival? So you said it's very, very hard because the headline acts are now so much. Do you manage to kind of take that space and kind of fit it within the festival experience somehow as well?
Yeah, I think you would often get the main stage, obviously, which is driven generally on headline talent. But then, most of our, well, all of our shows have multi stages, and I think stages 3 to 5 to 6. We'll often try and work with a much smaller club, so they'll get a brand fee and they'll program that stage, with their own. They have complete creative control, including the look and feel, of the stage. So I think, as best as we can, we do try and do that. I mean, I'd love to see a world where we don't, it's not driven on headline. And there are some shows that aren't, but it is a challenge, isn't it? Because you are then competing in, unfortunately, a very commercial world with
Yeah.
conglomerates.
So what is your passion there? So is your passion providing an incubation space to incubate new talent, or, and there's nothing wrong with like putting Beyonce on a big stage, because that could also be your passion to bring those big acts to a wider audience. I mean, there's no hierarchy there. One's no more noble than the other, I think. So what drives you with doing it? What, because you're doing all this, what is it that's like you'll get you out of bed in the morning? Is it like, I want to provide a space for new talent, or is it you just kind of get high on bringing in big acts, putting them on to more people?
For me, I'll be
Bit of
honest,
both.
yeah, well, it's twofold, really. It's also the promoter. We work as a promoter, so I love nothing more than working with a promoter who's sold out, say, Fabric, or is doing lots of club shows, and then comes to us and says, "Look, I want to transform this into a field environment." Oh, I've worked with many shows where they've started at 5,000 and now at 20, 25,000. That's exciting for me. So the promoter, and then within that, nurturing, some of those smaller sort of clubs who have had a stage. And again, the talents come through that. And then you see that talent transposed onto the main stage at some point, And I've got a massive passion for this, for music, the industry. I talk vociferously about my frustrations with, government, some of the agents in the world. I want to protect independent culture. That's my big passion, is around independence. Not everyone selling to the conglomerates. They've got a place. They're the ones that can afford to put Beyonce and tour her globally. I can't, and nor of the promoters I work with. So I want to make sure that independence still has, and it's so important. And I think often missed. There's not any headline that was at Glastonbury that hasn't come through the independent ecosystem that I know of. No one's getting parachuted in. So unless that's taken more seriously, there's going to be more failings. You're going to see less people and artists come through. So that's my why I get up, I guess.
So, is there anybody in the ecosystem that you would particularly pinpoint as kind of like not doing what they should be to help? I mean, I'm from the drinks industry now. That's kind of where I landed. So, I have a gin and it's launched in America. It's only in America. And for us, the bars are absolutely a crucial part of our ecosystem, because without the bars, people are not going to try your drink. It's all about, you've got to get our drink in a cocktail and in people's mouths, because they're never going to buy a $40 bottle of spirits without trying it first. So that is where people need to experience our brand for the first time. It's in bars. So we pump all our money, any spare cash we can, into doing events in little independent bars, in all the bars, working with the bartenders, because it's a symbiotic relationship that actually crucial to us. Is there anybody that you kind of feel within that ecosystem? I mean, does the drinks industry kind of do enough, do you think? Or do you think the drinks industry could be doing more? Could they step up a little bit somehow and start? pumping more money into those spaces rather than just kind of like, creaming off just selling drinks.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, you see the big sort of conglomerate brands, they will obviously be attracted to audience volume. So, someone like the big US conglomerates, they have 20, 30 show dates. That it's an easy deal to be done, isn't it? Where maybe 5 million people are going to those shows. They could do a global deal with a brand. So that money all gets centered around that. And then it's probably lost. All of their budget's gone. And I think there used to be a really good ecosystem of, say, drinks that would support the smaller venues. But now I do feel that they've moved away from that. I think also they used to pay sort of marketing and brand partnership fees to people like us and promoters because they wanted access to those people going to the shows because they didn't have their own marketing channels, whereas now they speak to their audience on a daily basis.
Yeah.
They bring out their own fans, so they don't spend. You used to get big money from, some of the big conglomerates I won't mention, whereas that isn't in existence because they do their own sort of activations. They talk to their own audience. So that I do think there needs to be support. It's not just about drinks. I think everybody, it's the agents, it's management, everybody needs to understand how important that ecosystem is. And I think for the last 5 or 10 years, that's been a bit lost. And I speak to DJs recently. I've had lots of conversations and said, do you realize that shows aren't making money even on sellout? And why would they know differently? But they just can't believe me. They're like, well, everyone thinks every promoter's a millionaire. That's absolute fiction. It doesn't exist. Their margins are so slim. So we need help from everyone, suppliers included. I bang this drum consistently. But yeah, and I think that's the one big difference I do see in the US is brand partners are much more engaged with all levels of show. I was involved in a Puerto Rican show up in Rochester, New York last year. They had 31 brand partners, albeit they're not paying hundreds of thousands of pounds, but they really do underwrite a show. Whereas in the UK, I'm not seeing as much as that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was going to be my next question. Like, how's the UK faring up against the US? Because you've got kind of a foot in both camps.
Yeah, I mean, I think the US it depends where you are. I mean, I was in Vegas last week. That feels a bit like a fight for the bottom. They just all obsessed around massive headline DJs. And the fees I was hearing it's just not workable. So they're underwriting it with other revenue from other parts of their business, whether it be the accommodation, the casinos, obviously. So that's a sad thing to hear. It should be more of a level playing field, and we shouldn't just be going for the big headline acts. But I think the US is, there's lots happening. But I do think the UK, often people talk about saturation, whereas in the US, I think it's far from saturated. There's a real desire. They want to go to shows. Sports is in their DNA. So they go to events consistently on a daily basis. But I do think there's opportunity for more festivals, more independence across every state. I don't think it's, fully there yet, which is really exciting. I mean, that's one of the reasons, we looked at this territory.
So you're in Vegas. Would you go to somewhere next, like Utah or Phoenix, somewhere really kind of, well, Utah's a bit more remote, parts of it, otherworldly.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at all sorts. I mean, the reason I'm in Denver is for that reason. This has got more microbreweries per head than anywhere else in the US.
Yep. Yep.
So things like that are exciting, where they've got little culture scenes. I think all of the sort of second cities, of which there are many in the US, have opportunities. I mean, here you've got Red Rocks Amphitheatre, which is very famous, but
Yeah. Know that. Been there.
yeah. So I think they're the exciting hubs. I mean, we're based out of Miami. Miami is really blowing up as an event center now, from everything from art to obviously the F1, a bit more obvious. But, I think all these cities are really starting to see more activity and more. Yeah, I mean, Miami's always had a sort of, smaller club scene, but I think that will come again.
It's so has Vegas still got the big sphere up?
It
The big
has.
dome. What
Yeah,
did you
yeah,
think of it?
massive. I mean, I heard when I was there that it cost something like $2 million in graphics. So that obviously has a restriction on the amount, the different talent that can do it. because I'm not seeing huge volumes of shows. I know the Eagles did it, obviously U2 opened it. I would expect to see more programmed. But yeah, I mean, it looks incredible. It is pretty. I mean, you could say it's an eyesore, but it's very visual. You can't miss it. And I do think sometimes we're over-regulated in the UK because obviously there was planning that went in for over Queen Elizabeth Park, and there would be light pollution. I get it, but I think things like those projects there's a massive innovation in technology and an overall experience, is incredible. So I do think sometimes we should be a bit more open, or maybe some of the planners should, because we've missed out on that now. There's no way they're going to come to the UK. It's just too over-regulated for them. Whereas in the US, it got planning, got through, and it was delivered within 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Vegas is a bit kind of runs on its own. It's very
Yeah,
close
it's a
shop that
different.
people,
Yeah,
yeah, there's about three or four people, I think, still that run Vegas. It's still very old school from that respect, isn't it? It's
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, we met with all the casinos. Yeah, I mean, the MGM own most of the Southern Strip. So,
Yeah, exactly. We find it. I mean, our gins with Dita Fontees, who's actually got the big show on in Vegas at the moment, does really well for us. So it was quite difficult for us to get our gin into any of the casinos or the bars because it's just a totally closed shop. But that was kind of a good route in for us.
yeah,
Obviously she's from
definitely.
like the burlesque scene, so it was a bit of a cultural play, really. It's a big show there, so that was kind of a nice route for us to be able to get into those venues, and we're in those venues there.
That's great.
Um, yeah, I mean it's very America because it has a three-tier system, which the UK doesn't have. So the three-tier system means that you can't be a producer and a retailer at the same time. You always have to have a distributor sat between you, which is completely different in the UK. Because of course you could make your own gin and you could go into any bar you wanted to and sell it direct, and that's not allowed. And it goes back to prohibition times. So after prohibition, they were like, we're never having that again. So there's always got to be a distributor, which means that distributors have so much power that they actually act pretty much like the mob used to because they have all the power now, and it's really hard to get a distributor. So
Gosh, no, that's
the
totally.
yeah, so for us, there's some huge differences between the UK and the US. So with what you do you think it's similar? I guess it's compliance, it's openness, it's being strict, but also it's the knowing who ultimately calls the shots. Do you think?
Yeah, and I think in the US it is quite different. There's not this sort of you're not nationally regulated like you are in the UK. So it's very individualized state to state. So on things like permitting, from Florida to California, very different. But the one thing I suppose over the last couple of years here is just everyone trades nationally. There used to be this sort of thing that, people would maybe trade Florida and then the next day like New York, whereas everybody, they use planes like we use trains in the UK. Everybody, they work all over America, and obviously there's 340 million plus people here. So it's just the market. It's uncomparable to the UK, when you're trading at that level, and so much stuff is headquartered here. And some of the budgets that I hear here are, they're just insurmountable. We've seen two briefs recently that just doesn't exist in the UK, and I've never seen a budget like that. So that obviously creates, lots of opportunity, I guess.
Yeah. And how do you see the difference between kind of like what's happening in culture and subculture in America and what's happening in the UK? Do you see it's different? Do you think they're still distinctly different, or do you think these days everything's just a kind of melting pot and there is no real kind of geographical boundaries? It's just all happening at the same time, or do you see like little pockets of exciting things happening in certain places that, like you had grunge in Seattle and then it grew out? Do you think are you still seeing that when you're out? There's something particular to a certain area?
I think there's different, like I said about Denver with microbreweries, for example, I call that, that's a little scene in itself. So
Yeah.
people come to Denver to experience that. I do think with with social media, well, it could be an unfortunate thing that there's a lot more commonality globally because obviously people have access to social media on a daily basis. So, things are mimicked a lot quicker, whereas I think years ago, you used to have a scene like come out of London or come out of New York, and it would take a few years to then populate across the globe. So they would lead it and own that whatever that culture was. Whereas now it's sort of instantaneous, and then someone's so that's a bit sad for me. But I do, there are definitely little things like, Miami's become quite synonymous with Art Basel, etc. So that's definitely still in existence. And there's people I meet here who, are really passionate about delivering or building smaller clubs, smaller sort of workspaces. Yeah, to nurture talent, get people out of home. I think, it's a challenge for us all. Get people into these sort of cultural environments is really, really important.
So thinking about it as like kind of DIY entrepreneurialism, which we were just talking about before you came on. These kind of like little spaces that are being created so that you can nurture new talent and things. Is that more, it's other people providing those spaces for them to come in, or is it themselves? Is the spirit DIY still alive and well? So they're creating their own record labels, their own spaces, their own radio shows, their own channels. They're not reliant on somebody else? Or do you feel like these days it's important that infrastructure is created by somebody else so that it can come in? Or do you see DIY alive and well?
Uh, I would say there's quite a lot where it's integral that the space is provided, but there are loads of opportunities there. For example, in the UK, we work with lots of property developers. They have massive void units. I mean, there's loads of void units across the world at the moment. So, I'm trying to always push that. But like community radio, they should be in these centres. They're driving traffic. They're a cultural, they're so important. I mean, you see lots in Peckham, but I think they're the sort of opportunities where they've got core and shell already done there. They've got power. I think it's very expensive. I think is the other. If you go to a landlord, you try and broker a deal in a disused space. There's a huge amount of cost to get it into working order. Whether it's just getting power and distro, water, etc., sanitary provision. So I think that we are quite reliant on. The infrastructure already be in existence, or at least being supported by whether it'll be someone who owns the land or the building. Yeah.
Kind of dream festival then for you. What is it? What are the components? What are the elements? What
Uh,
are you putting in there? What's
I mean,
not just
primarily,
the
obviously,
toilets,
not the toilets and the
not
fence.
just the
They're
toilets. Well,
needed.
the toilets are like up there. They're like pretty important.
They're pretty important. Primarily, obviously, being independently owned, so the promoters are independently owned. And then for me, I love smaller shows. For me, going to a 50,000 capacity show, going to main stage and watching the talent off a delay tower, I don't get it. It's just not something. So, finding something that's also not just about music, everything, whether it be food, like, I talk about this a lot, but like independence, they really care about that curation. So like from the food, the drink, they'll work with the local brewery if they can, if the local brewery can do volume. They will work with local, food caterers, etc. So that for me is the whole overall experience, because that generally, that will nurture the audience as well. And in a 5,000, I mean, it's very hard to do those shows and make money, but just if it's a weekend show, you'll know people, you'll keep bumping into them, and I think that's what it is. It's that community. Whereas at a massive conglomerate show, you're not. It's very. I mean, 80,000 people. How are you going to bump into people very often? So I think that there's a sense of community, and by the end, when you leave, it's like, wow, that was an amazing event. I shared some experiences with people I've never met, and people I probably will speak to, for the rest of my life. It's where people
Yeah.
fall in love, isn't it? People make friends for life. It's escapism from all of the stuff we have to do every day. That's why it's so important.
Yeah. My favorite festivals that I used to go to is I used to live in sort of Switzerland, and my fellow was in an American car club. They were the Europe chapter of it. And so there used to be the big festivals in Berlin, and we used to have them in Switzerland all the time that would go. So there would still be bands and there'd be music and there'd be food trucks, but it was mostly like everybody would bring their classic cars. So if you came in your
That's
classic
cool.
car, you got in for free, and then everybody would park like that. And it just sort of doubled down on the experience, because as well as the bands and the food trucks, you'd like spend all day walking up and down the line for all these beautiful like American cars. Anything pre 75 counted. and all these incredible classic cars. And when you talk about community, that was the way that all the chapters would come together and they would meet in this place for the weekend. They were my kind of favorite sort of
Yeah, well, you've got
festivals.
common thread then, haven't you? You've got something to discuss immediately. You know what I mean? Which is
Yeah,
what's about your car and your passion for it. I think anything driven on a passion project, which everyone's there for the same reason, and then have chats about, I think it's really important. That's amazing. Things like
yeah.
that.
Yeah, I used
Um,
to love those. And we don't have them so much here in the UK. There weren't so many, but I think it's just because the UK is just not big enough. Like,
yeah,
and the UK is not big enough to have those great big American cars either. They're not driving down our streets. So the sort of UK chapters are quite small and they don't have a lot of vehicles. So you would have to like go to Europe for them really for the bigger kind of car events.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so just not as much space here in I don't know if you could have like Burning Man in the UK, could you? Or I mean,
Think you struggle.
it's
Think you
like it would be
struggle.
quite difficult to, it'd be a bit sort of Wicker Man, wouldn't it? And it would be like Wicker Man. I think that would be the sort of
Yeah,
version of it on the Shetlands or
you'd be a
something.
mile away from a pub or something.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
it
we
just
are quite. Well, our land is quite full, I would say. Whereas obviously the US has plenty of land, which is very true. So,
yeah, yeah. And do you have like a sort of, I mean, you talked about it's all about the music and coming together and da da da. We can't ever forget that, can we? Do you have like one kind of like records that really stood out for you? Like you were in the, because presumably you enjoy your own festivals. You actually go to them and you try and enjoy them as a punter and walk around. You're not just stuck in an office somewhere with a clipboard, I'm hoping. You do get out and
oh
about.
no, that's really important. You want to go out. I mean,
Yeah,
if you're just stuck in the office, I mean, you might as well be not at the
yeah,
show. So yeah, getting out, seeing public, speaking to the public as well, getting their feedback, speaking to the bar,
yeah.
everyone, all suppliers. But my team, yeah, it's really, really important. The promoter, obviously essential, understanding, and there's always challenges, isn't there? I mean, no shows just doesn't happen. It's that easy. There's always going to be challenges, overcoming them, making sure, you can plan as much as you can. I think, sea change moments for me were, well, when I first got into clubs, I remember Paradise in Islington. I was really into drum and bass. I used to manage some drum and bass artists. Yeah, two things. I remember going to Paradise and there we went quite a lot. It was one of the first clubs where you didn't have to wear shoes, which was mental. Everyone wore Reebok Classics. And yeah, they had a resident called Joe 90, and it was amazing. I was just like, wow, this is what it's about. This is escapism in its true belief. I understood it then. It all sort of dropped. And then getting into things like Bookham, which obviously everyone knows now, but back then when him and
Mm.
Conrad first started doing shows, it was game changing for drum and bass anyway.
Yeah. I just did an interview for Boyzone. They were doing some more kind of like, they didn't want to just feature DJs and bands on their website. They wanted to do some stuff that was a bit more sort of club adjacent, people that have come out of that kind of scene. And what they're doing now, which kind of feeds into, I don't know if you know Andy Kreisel, but he's a big writer and journalist, and he's got a book out at the moment. It's called Selling the Night.
Oh
It's
yeah,
brilliant
yeah,
book.
yeah. I
Yeah,
did
you'll
see some of that.
probably you'd really enjoy it. And he has a theory, and it was kind of similar to what Boyzone were talking about as well, that nightlife and going out and clubbing was a very good route into the creative industries, particularly for the working classes. So everybody that sort of came out of that went on to do something like something creative. It kind of sparked a lit fuse that never went away, and it was their kind of route. And I wonder if you feel the same way because you are in a similar position. You come out of that scene and those experiences, and you've taken it with you. And was that your route into this creative
Yeah.
industry?
100%. Yeah, I worked in a bar, and then through that met a promoter who ran a show, and then I became a lighting jock at a club, very basic lighting jock, I would add. But then I was in the booth with all the DJs, do you know what I mean? So I met pretty much every DJ every weekend. Some of them would look down on you, but some of them, and then that's how I met, yeah, a load of sort of DJs who would then introduce me to promoters. And then I became a promoter for my sins, and realized how much money it cost and lose. And then I thought, oh, hang on, I'll
With
offer
it
these
though.
services.
Yeah.
uh, and then started working with promoters. and saying, well, look, I'll deliver the service. You can worry about the talent, the booking, delivering the audience. I'll do all of the other bits. So yeah, I definitely came through that route and loved it. I absolutely loved the journey. I worked on doors, I did guest lists, all the things that you can imagine within a club, and that's exciting. It was so exciting. Yeah. And that's where I met all my contacts was through that. I didn't, sending an email to say, hey, yeah, I think that's quite challenging, isn't it? You need to be in it, I feel.
Yeah.
Uh,
And so do you sort of hope that everything that you're doing now is also kind of sparking that light in some of the people that come to your show and they go off and think, I'm going to do this in my town, albeit on a much smaller scale, but they're like, I'm going to put something on, I'm going to do something when I get back. I suppose the fact that you're even doing this course is a part of helping facilitate that. And
yeah.
kind of, is that the reason why you did it? And do you hope it's sparking? And do you see anything else in the future that you could do to help continue to facilitate that? Because incubating is not just about incubating the actual bands and the music; it's about incubating the people to like put
Yeah.
these spaces on, which
100%.
is exactly what you're doing with the course. So, do you see like developing into some other routes or some other things that you're going to do together with AD, or how you're going to keep flying the flag to, you know,
Yeah, and I think I've always been talking about, we need talent to come through. And like you say, it's not about the musical side. It's all of the rest of the system that needs, whether it be tech people, whether it be producers like my team, you need production coordinators. Without them, there is no show. No show, no talent. So yeah, so Event Masters was launched off the back of that. I think we did a lot of market research. We've seen lots of courses out there, which I would say are not that accessible from a price point of view. So the whole point of this was to make it more accessible and to give people, knowledge. If you're going into an interview and have a fairly, whether it be basic or intermediary level of knowledge of that interview, I think it's going to really help. And that was the purpose of this, because not any of the sort of course detail is that readily available on the internet. So for that reason, we wanted to compile it based on, years and years of expertise for myself, for my team, media as well, working in events. So yeah, make it more accessible, trying to encourage, all people back into the industry, because we did lose quite a few during COVID for obvious reasons, because it wasn't an industry. So yeah, I'm passionate about that. I mean, to the extension where I've been speaking to universities about potential sort of underwriting of some courses in the future. But, that's something that I'm also equally passionate about, getting people into the music and making it interpretable. I mean, I wasn't great in education system. I didn't particularly, after GCSEs, love it. So something that, spoke to me in a language that was less condescending. Or educationally driven is important as well.
yeah, yeah. And I think that particularly in today, it's, I mean, I don't know about you, but I just get bored to death with like the ongoing debate around AI. It's like the only thing that anybody can talk about right now, isn't it? It's
True,
like
true,
it's the
true.
only thing that people talks about. But there's a couple of things that AI can never touch, where we'll always beat the bots, and that's in what it is to be human and flawed and messy. And these kind of real life experiences and these coming together of people to do this really mad thing which is called dancing, which makes no logical sense. Like no AI would ever come up with that solution to anything at all. It makes no
No.
sense. So it's really important what you're doing and what everybody in your field is doing, and I think even so, even more so now, and just providing those spaces where people can actually come together and interact with each other as humans in a kind of messy way. I think the other thing that's happening at the moment, isn't there, with the no phones on the dance floor,
Yeah,
which I talk about quite a lot, because it needs to be able, we need to have those spaces. And with surveillance and privacy becoming more pervasive in our lives, that those kind of spaces away from that become more valuable. So do you do anything like that? Would you imagine that coming into like no phones on the floor at festivals, or no phones, or just to allow people to get messy and human and not have this digital footprint follow them around at every job interview?
yeah, and we've seen that in behavioural trends actually. So there's a sort of juxtaposition, because I work a lot with the sort of Met Police on look at criminality at shows,
Mm.
and there's a juxtaposition between obviously the criminals and the OCGs, so organised crime groups that are they're committing crime, but then also you see a lot of these peers and sort of Gen Zs and other generations kind of shows, and they're so nervous about how they'll be perceived on social media that actually the behaviour is sort of immaculate, like they don't want to be. Whereas I'm, back in my day, festivals, escapism. I'm not saying everyone should go and get smashed, but you should feel free to act how you want, obviously within reason.
Mm.
And that has been missing. And yeah, I've seen some dreadful content where people are literally swaying with their phone for the headline talent. I mean, just don't be there.
Yeah.
Just, and I would love to see it. You've seen it in clubs like High are doing it, lots of clubs in Ibiza, and some of the smaller clubs are doing no phones policy. I'd love to see that at shows. It's just a different thing, isn't it? People want to capture that moment. But when I see people videoing a whole set, I'm like, you will never ever watch that ever again.
Yeah.
And I think there's lots of challenges. I was at a conference recently, and this young man stood up and said, I'm so sick to death of hearing about Gen Z. We've got this social contract with society that we have to support the older generation, and it's really wearing. And I was like, you know what? That it's a fair point. Like the older generation, we're all getting a lot older. People are living longer, and I think there's this inherent pressure on the younger generations consistently getting banged on about Gen Z, this, that. They don't want to do anything, whereas they do. And I just think we need to give them a break and, need to support them. And if we can do things like no phones and they then experience the no phones, you'll see, it'll help, won't it, creatively? Because at the
Yeah.
moment it's very sort of transactional, it feels, which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah. I think there's also a big thing at the moment going on with nostalgia and how we deal with nostalgia because unfortunately Gen X cannot stop banging on about like the past. But I always feel like it's not it's about looking back to look forward. It's about finding meaning in the past, not memory, and taking that meaning and how can we use it. So it's not being nostalgia and trying not to be kind of like rose tinted about the past because honestly it was pretty boring most of the time.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
really fucking boring most of the time, and
yeah,
there was everything seemed very more inaccessible than it is now. But I think it's more that really, and what can we take from the past? And I think even if it does get a bit nostalgic, at least it's reminding people that they care, and I think that's a good place to start. So if we're always banging on about the virtues of analog and things that can't skip and things that can't repeat. And so you've got to be there for it in that moment and then it's gone for good. And the virtue of that, I think, at least if there's no tangible output from that, it's just reminding people that they care about that and it is actually valuable. But how do you communicate that to young people when they've never experienced it in the first place and they spent so much time in COVID, like lockdown for 4 or 5 years, which can never be
no,
underestimated. That's a huge, bizarre chunk to lose. It's how do you remind them that they're missing something in the first place, which comes back to probably the very first thing that I said, like young people never had money to go out, but they made it happen. So it's about reminding people to go out.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. Yeah, because if you've never experienced it, why would you know different? So I think, yeah, encouraging them to, go out and enjoy themselves. That's the other important thing. I sometimes worry that, with the exponential growth in social media, the attention spans are reduced, so people are always looking for the next dopamine hit. And I think that's a concern, whereas maybe that wasn't so existent. You really nurtured that. You were in the moment more. And I do sometimes worry that people are like, oh, I'm really loving this, but what's next? What's next? What's next?
Mm.
Including my age, all generations, because we all,
Yeah.
we're in this
Mm.
doom scrolling culture. But so I think, yeah, trying to almost slow down, those cultural sort of moments is really, really important, and really like putting your phone away and being in that moment. And I think I'm guilty of it. We're all guilty of it. You're at something and think, oh, but what about if this happened, or how could you improve on that? So I think it's really important to encourage them to go out and experience it, because it is amazing, isn't it? I don't think there's anything that can beat being in, whether it be at a festival, in a little club, because there's not many times where you get to really escape. current sort of societal pressures that I believe in. Meals, everyone has a place in different cultural things, whether it be food and beverage, etc. But going into a club and raving, as people do, it does bring that escapism, and and it brings that community together, and it's something really, really special, I feel.
Yeah. So you're never going to leave the industry then? You're going to stay in it till like, what does retirement look like? Is there such a thing as retirement for Nick? Or is
Uh,
it like they can take me out in a coffin of the festival and, bury me behind the main stage? Is it that?
I mean, I only want to stay in the industry when I'm relevant. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to be one of these, guys saying back in the day, this is what we used to do. I just can't stand that sort of
No.
narrative. So, if I'm still relevant and doing good, like I sit on a lot of trade boards, then obviously I'll be there. I just don't want to be one of those ones that, hangs on till the bitter end and people are like, Jesus Christ, it's him again. I don't want to be that person. So, yeah, still while relevant, I'll still be here, I hope.
Do you suspect you'll ever like end up being not relevant? I don't think so. Would you? If you don't want to be? If
I
it's,
mean,
I think it's like, as long as you're conscious of that, if you have
yeah,
that kind of like self-awareness, then you will always like be
yeah,
relevant.
and I guess I'm very lucky, fortunate with team. Team very all ages, but weighted towards the youth. And being around them keeps you young. I think it's so important.
Mm.
I see some of my mate. I mean, they're in different industries, but they feel older than I am, which makes me feel great.
Mm.
So I think, yeah, I want to be relevant, but you never know. I do see people who have done something for 50 years, and they do become a bit irrelevant. And yeah, but
I've only got
yeah,
one thing, last thing to say, but it's sort of on that note. So, because it's so relevant to now, Oasis this summer, thoughts, summer of dad rock. What are
um,
your thoughts? Are you going? Did you
I'm
line up
not
for a
going.
ticket?
I
I'm not
didn't.
going either.
No.
What do you think about it as an experience?
Uh, I mean, I used to see them a lot because someone I knew did their sort of close protection years ago. I just think I just think the whole ticketing thing is a bit of a debacle. It's really unfair on the fan. Not a lot's happened about it, and I think more should be done. It needs to be accessible. There's an element of greed. I get it. You go back on the road, you want to tour. Maybe you need some more funds. I'll be interested to see how it is. But any time I've seen Oasis before, it hasn't been my vibe. It's been like going to a football show. Yeah, so there's a lot of sort of testosterone flying around, I felt, but we'll see. We'll see. I mean, again, if you're the 80,000th person at that show in a stadium, you're going to be watching it off a delay. Is that a great experience?
Yeah.
It was absolutely amazing to meet you today, Sarah. I've heard so many good things from AD about you, so I was very interested to hear, especially around some of the stuff you're doing now as well. Yes, thank you very much for taking the time.
And thank you for having me, and it was nice to meet you too. I have this like it's funny at the Museum of Youth Culture is like exhibiting some of the objects I've collected from the past 30 years. I call it my empire of dirt, and it's things from like flyers and old posters, tape recordings, and it's a collection that's going on at the end of next year. And we always have like a little kind of saying, which is like fly the flag. So it's like flying the flag for kind of like, subculture and for culture and music and fashion and everything sort of coming together. So I will end up our chat by saying, yeah, fly the flag. And thank you for having me. And I was very pleased to be able to talk about this stuff because I could talk about it like till the cows come home. So I'm
Brilliant.
always really happy to talk about culture and subculture and just being messy and being real life.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much,
Nick.
all.
It was good to
All
meet
right,
you.
I'll see you
Thank you.
soon. All right,
Bye.
bye.
Bye.